Yeah, we made some copies a week ago. So I'll have him get you. Yeah, let's get like 5 of them. Yeah, the book is sold out, but we were able to. Samba, mashallah, he scanned the chapter we're reading. So we were able to, inshallah, print that section of the book. Yeah. Any questions about the readings? Anything anybody read? They feel like they would like to get just a little bit more clarity on. Reem? Yes, sister.
I think I had a question from last time.
Yeah.
We were talking about Riyah.
No.
I think I was just my question was, how would you make sure you avoid that?
No.
But also given like in certain circumstances, like especially like a professional setting, like at work and stuff, sometimes that could be confused like you're not confident. So what would be the difference and like how can we avoid both?
Yeah, so how can you avoid Riyah? How can you be like confident that you don't have Riyah? Yeah? And then in a professional setting it can come across as maybe uncertainty?
Yeah, you're uncertain, you're not confident, you're not competent.
Can you maybe clarify that question? What do you mean by like?
A lot of the work settings, it's you have to kind of brag about your performances.
Right.
Which doesn't come naturally, I think, if you have this background.
Right. Yeah, especially coming from I think a Muslim background is a bit unique, and I would say just general faith backgrounds, but I would say Muslims a little bit more because it's just kind of very, it's very looked down upon, right? And the deen does, but it's like, okay, so when do you make an exception, right? And how do you kind of know when to make that exception? And when does that hopefully like not like, imply like Riyah? I think those are 2 excellent questions. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We can start with those 2 questions, inshallah. We people have been asking about time. Some of the sisters were like, what time do we start? So I told them 7 p.m. I don't want to start before 7. So we'll just kind of take these Q&As, inshallah ta'ala, before we start. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As far as the first question, how can we be confident we don't have Riyah, that we don't have ulterior motives, that we aren't showing off for the attention of others? I don't think we can ever be sure we don't have Riyah. Wallahu alam, that's my understanding. Riyah is shirkun khafi. It's a very subtle form of shirk. Kind of like a person could have like an illness and not know that they have an illness till like more severe symptoms show. And so Riyah is kind of like that. A person might think like they're sincere and they have piety, and it isn't until a trial comes and we see that maybe they actually were not sincere and there were ulterior motives, and so now the believer is never in feeling a sense of like security that I have sincerity. Rather, the believer is terrified. Is supposed to be in a state of fear that maybe I'm not sincere with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as I should be. And so I think that's indicated in the dua of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an ushrika bika shay'an a'lamu wa astaghfiruka lima a'lamu. Right? Oh Allah, I seek your protection from associating partners with you knowingly, and I seek your forgiveness for that for which I might do unknowingly. Lima la a'lamu. Right? So the believer can never be sure that they're sincere. Rather, a sign of piety is the fear of hypocrisy, right? The fear of insincerity. One of the Salaf, he says, I have met 70 of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and each one of them feared hypocrisy, feared that they had hypocrisy. And so the sign of piety is this, I think I won't say self-criticism, but this self-introspection is a sign of piety, where a person is really always introspecting, not in a discouraging way, because it can become easily switch into like something like very like, counterproductive. That's not the point. Not in a way to put the person down, but in a way for them to realize the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to realize the deficiencies with their own intentions, right? So it's not supposed to be off-putting. It's not supposed to be discouraging, but it's supposed to be an experience that grants us humility or an introspection that makes us humble with Allah, allowing us to recognize the greatness of Allah and allowing us to realize the deficiencies within our own hearts. So does that answer your first question? Yeah? And so again, with what we mention here, it can easily become very off-putting, like Ayan mentioned last week. What if somebody's kind of like, oh, I want to do this extra ibadat, but I'm fearful that maybe I might have ulterior motives. Am I sincere? You get to enter the space of like self-doubt, and you start to lose confidence in your ibadat, and it can be really intrusive and obsessive thoughts. And so we don't want it to turn into that type of like waswasa, where a person is kind of really having these like intrusive, obsessive thoughts, where they're always like doubting their sincerity. And so anytime that happens, we said the remedy is to actually realize to do the act in the face of those emotions is a demonstration of sincerity. To remedy that type of, maybe trap a person might fall into. And so we want to make sure that's not happening. But the purpose of this is for us to realize the danger of shirk and the subtleties of shirk and how we can kind of settle in the heart and go unnoticed, or and appear kind of undetected. And so the person is always introspecting and always looking at their intentions to make sure is, what is my motive? What is my drive? Why? What is my objective? Right? This is something that the believer must always ask. What is my objective? Always introspecting the intention. And we mentioned that this is the most difficult act of Islam. Sincerity is the most difficult act of Islam, and I think, for numerous reasons. One is because the human ego's tendency of self-interest, right? Our human ego, our ego by nature, is driven by self-interest, right? We're driven by rewards and benefits. We're driven by fame and wealth and status, pride and dignity. So because of that human nature to always be pursuing our own self-interest, sincerity becomes the complete opposite, right? It's to do not for yourself, but for the beloved, Allah Ta'ala. And so therefore sincerity, ikhlas, is the most difficult thing. What is your passion? What is your reason? Why are you doing this? And there's so many degrees and layers. And so, sincerity is it's the most difficult act. Because of that, or at least that's one reason why many of our scholars have considered it the most difficult act. Another reason, I think, that maybe this is just my opinion, me just kind of, making my own kind of analysis, is the human conscious naturally converts everything into automated behaviors, right? We have our conscious and our subconscious mind, and our conscious mind is always trying to preserve energy. And what does it do? The subconscious mind learns and automates our actions, and so that the conscious mind doesn't have to think. and exhaust effort in being mindful of that action. And so that's what happens, right? When you first, anything in life, right? We just kind of automate it. Even when you love someone, you love them in the beginning passionately, and that relationship over time just becomes really automated. And now how do you keep that passion alive? It's hard. That's why the first year or two of marriage, the first year generally, they say roughly, up to like 12 months, 10, 12 months is really that passionate period of the marriage. And then after that, marriage kind of becomes automated, routines and behaviors and things like that. So how do you maintain passion? How do you maintain love? How do you maintain that intentionality and excitement in that relationship? And this is just kind of human nature. Our mind automates things, and eventually we just kind of adapt, and the passion dies. And that's fine with worldly affairs, right? Automating how you drive your car, riding your bike, whatever, doing your job. Like a lot of it just becomes really intuitive and automated processes. But with worship, we're not supposed to do that. Right? With worship, we can't automate our acts of worship. Our worship has to be a heart-centric devotion. And that's hard. That takes effort. To be cognitively and emotionally aware and present in every act of worship takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of devotion. Mentally, it's hard. Like some of our scholars, they said, it is nearly impossible to pray 2 rak'ah without distraction. Right? The scholars have mentioned this. To pray 2 rak'ah without distraction, they say it's nearly impossible. Very few have mastered the salah to an extent where they can pray 2 rak'ah without completely getting distracted. And so I think that also makes intention, sincerity harder, because it's kind of counter to our nature. Our nature wants to automate everything. But being intentional and mindful of our purpose and drive is something that is counter to our intention. Now, subhanAllah, research studies have shown that mindfulness is another term I think modernity uses for insincerity is mindfulness. Mindfulness enhances our experiences and our performances. Right? So they say anything, like even eating, mindful walking, right? Mindful anything. If you can, develop that type of condition yourself to be really present with what you do. Don't let your mind automate it, but really teach yourself to be present in your experiences. Your experiences now tend to become a lot more fulfilling, a lot more enjoyable. You get a lot more out of them. Actually, you perform better. Right? When you're mindful, even like working out, they say if you're for weightlifters, and this is kind of one of my interests as well, is just like weightlifting and stuff. And so, I remember there's these research studies that are being quoted, and he's like, research has shown that those who lift weights and are mindful of the weights they're lifting and present with their movements and the muscles they're using and feeling the different joint, muscles that they're trying to really build in those workouts, they get actually a lot more progress and productivity out of their workouts than those who just kind of work out, in a kind of automated kind of, routine, right? So sincerity is kind of teaching us to go against that nature to automate things and to be present. And so for that reason, I think that's also part of why having sincerity is also very difficult. First of all, our ego is very self-centered. And then second, our subconscious wants to automate everything so the conscious mind can rest and not have to exert so much energy in our daily tasks. And so because of those two things, I think, sincerity is really the most difficult act that a person can engage in. Wallahu alam. All right, we can dive into our readings, inshallah ta'ala. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Alhamdulillah. Before we start, Brother Nasser, We're scheduled for 8. Am I correct? Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I didn't mix up my times. Okay, barakallah fiqh. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So good thing is, I have another meeting at 8, so inshallah I won't be going over time. And so we can get started inshallah ta'ala. Last week, we started, Imam al-Ghazali, we read that Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he divided riya into 3 categories, and then each category has its own subcategories. So the first, he mentions rahimahullah ta'ala, the mura'i, al-mura'a bihi, wal-mura'a lahu, and the intention, wal-mura'a, wa nafs qasd al-niyya, or nafs qasd I think the niyya, yani nafs al-niyya, yani. The intention itself, okay? So the first one is al-mura'a bihi, right? He mentions that the means by which a person is performing riya, right? So what are the means by which the person is performing riya? And then the second is the audience that they're performing riya for. And the third is the actual intention of the riya, okay? And then he mentions that regarding the first pillar, showing off may be done purely for other people without any hope, reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, sorry, excuse me. Now, he starts, rahimahullah ta'ala, by first saying that showing off may be done purely for other people without any hope of reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says that it may be done for Allah's sake, simultaneously trying to seek reward from others. And if I was to take percentages, all right, he says, and I believe the first case is similar to the above statement, is when a person purely seeks reward from people, meaning they're doing acts of worship, purely seeking reward from people. The second category is that they do acts of worship primarily for seeking reward from others, and then there's a small percentage which they're seeking reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that clear? Right? So he says these two are pretty similar. Like they are committing shirk khafi, they risk the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon them. There's the warning of Allah's wrath upon those people. All right? We have the example of the man who was generous, we have the example of the martyr, we have the example of the scholar. All of these people, what did they do these noble acts of worship for? They did it for the sake of their status and fame. All right, those two first categories. And then he says the third category is someone who's 50-50. They have the motive for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while they also want to get some worldly status, some worldly gain and benefit. And I would say riya is generally in one of 3 things. There could be other forms, but primarily you kind of see riya in fame, people seeking like recognition and fame. Second, some type of material benefit, right? So they're seeking to get some type of reward. If I do this, I will get this type of reward from other people. I'll get a job. In the hadith, أو امرأة ينكحها, they're going to marry a woman. If he, mashallah, can put on the image that he's a righteous person. And so he's going to get that worldly benefit. Allah mentions people, the al-Khattab before that, اشتروا بآيات الله ثمنا قليلا. They traded the signs of Allah for a small price. So there's some type of material benefit that people will get. And so therefore, they sacrifice their sincerity with Allah for some material benefit of the world. And then the third is ego, pride. They need to be right. They need to show superiority. And so these are usually, I would say, the top 3 motives for people's riya. They're not the only ones, But I would say these are the top 3 motives for people to riyah. And this is something that I've just kind of, introspecting, looking at the text and what our scholars have mentioned in the hadith. You usually find that it's these 3 things. It's fame and position, fame and recognition, or material benefit of something of the world. And third, it's going to be ego and pride. And so Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he gives the percentages, and so he says the third case is the one of whom his intentions are half-half. He wants worldly gain and benefit. He also wants the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he says that regarding that third person, the outward meaning of the prophetic text indicate that his safety from hellfire is in doubt. And so he's saying this person, they're still also in great risk. They're also in great risk if their intention is kind of 50-50. I want to worship Allah, but I also want people to praise me and appreciate me. Or I also want to get this substantial worldly benefit from what I'm doing. 50-50. He says, the reason he says there's doubt, because he's saying, I think Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, this is my own deduction. From a rational perspective, 50-50 means that the good deed and bad deed kind of cancel each other out. Does that make sense? 50-50 is kind of worst case, there's no reward, but there's no punishment. Does that make sense? Rationally speaking, that's if we were to use percentages. But then he says that if we look at the prophetic text, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Hadith Qudsi, أَنَا أَغْنَى الشُّرَكَاءِ عَنِ الشِّرْكِ. I am the most independent I am the most independent with regards to partners. Whoever does a deed and associates others with me, I leave him to that which he associated with me. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is أغنى الشركاء عن الشرك. He doesn't accept association of any sort. And so whoever does that, it indicates that there's some type of wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon that person whose motive is where they're equating something to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, the primary examples we'll give is worldly benefit. We're going to give fame and status, or ego and pride and superiority. If this is kind of what they're looking at, they're looking to get something from this, and they're also okay, well, I also want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the process. If those two are the same, then he's like most likely this person is in risk. But there's also an argument that can be made. We don't know. That's not a condition that we want to be in at all anyways, to begin with, right? That's not something a believer wants to even risk, having these dual intentions of seeking Allah's reward while also seeking some other ulterior motive for oneself or ego. And the fourth case, he said, is the intention of a man who seeks reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that outweighs his riyah to seek reward in some other, for some other worldly gain. And he said, this person, we hope that, that they will have some reward. Although he says, again, it's still a little terrifying to be in this position, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am above anyone ascribing partners to me, the hadith I quoted. And so he said that, he says even this case is still above, it still has some, fear because of that hadith. But because their sincerity is greater, we hope that it does appear that they will receive some reward, that they won't be subject to Allah's wrath, that they will receive some reward. Wallahu alam. And so, if a person sees these four cases, it's difficult to say, my intentions are completely pure for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Does that make sense? It's hard to say that. And so that is why we always seek forgiveness. We always fear insincerity. It's a part of Iman. It's a part of Iman that the believer always fears insincerity. We must always fear that. And we must always ask Allah for sincerity. And we mentioned the prophetic hadith, to make that a part of our adhkar. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an ushrika bika shay'an a'lamu wa astaghfiruka lima a'lamu. Right? Memorize that. Right? Memorize that always. And then the second is istighfar. Always start with, why do we always start with seeking forgiveness? It's not because we believe in that the human beings are by nature sinful. like the Christians do, right? The Christians, they believe like, we all carry the sin of our father Adam alayhi salam, right? They have that's their belief, right? And so as Muslims we don't have that. Everybody is born innocent of sin, right? وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. But we fear our flawed nature as human beings might get in the way of the sincere devotion we should give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Intentionally or unintentionally, we might be doing things, and one of those things we always fear is maybe I'm just not sincere. And so we always ask Allah for forgiveness. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Right? For fear that maybe I'm lacking in my sincerity, in my motives, and my, and what. That's one aspect. We also fear our performance as well. But one of the things we fear our insincerity or with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially seeing how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam reports, the dangers of riyah. Do we see that? Like the people first cast into hellfire are people that are apparently pious. Apparently pious people. So we consider them to be among the most pious people. The philanthropist, the scholar, the mujahid, who's more pious than these three people? And generally, do we consider these people the most selfless, courageous, dedicated, intelligent people who have given everything for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And subhanAllah, for them to end up in hell? Na'udhu billah. So the believer fears that. We fear the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am above anyone ascribing partners to me. So the believer fears, Ya Rabb. Ya Rabb, forgive me if I have ascribed partners to you in any way. Right? We fear that. And again, us as human beings, we're so driven by self-interest. We're so driven by self-gains and benefits. Even when we don't realize, sometimes we think we're sincere, and we don't realize that maybe we're worshiping to show some type of superiority. And we speak down to people, subhanAllah, right? Look at this subtle way that sometimes riyah can show. We speak down to people who might not be as practicing the deen. Like we're superior to them. So ask yourself, in that type of case, is that person worshiping Allah to feel a sense of superiority over others? Because if they're boasting of their worship, oh, I know this much Quran, what do you know? Then that shows, okay, so there's some type of self-interest, right? Like you wanna feel superior to others. So you're boasting in that manner. So how sincere are you? The believer fears that. Or sometimes we feel entitled. I'm so-and-so, how come I'm not being... So if you feel entitled, that shows that somewhere in your heart, there's a subtle riyah that is giving you the entitlement to say like, I am worthy of this because of what I have done. So is that what you were worshiping Allah for? So you can attain this superiority over others? This position or whatever it might be over others? Right? So Imam Malik rahimahullah, he says in a statement, that if you see a man raising his voice in argument, in debate, no, I don't recall the exact wording, but be aware that this person has some ulterior motive. Because if a person is yelling and arguing, yelling in a debate, well, it's more about proving they're right than pursuing the truth. Right? Because you get passionate to prove yourself right. But if you're sincerely seeking truth, there would be no reason to raise your voice and try to intimidate the other person and show them that they're less than you and anything of that, and that you're smarter than them and that you are correct in your opinion. SubhanAllah, who can say I've never done any of this? That these subtle things have not showed up in maybe some ways or forms. Who can say they will never show up? And if they do, what does that mean about our intentions? Right? So the believer always fears insincerity. But inshallah, in this last case, he does say that there is some hope that his reward decreases, but they still receive some reward, right? And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to always deal with us with mercy and compassion, right? And because if Allah dealt with us with justice and fairness, what would be our outcome, right? And so we always ask Allah to deal with us with mercy and compassion and forgiveness. Allahumma ameen. So that's the first pillar he speaks about. The second pillar he speaks about, the second pillar he says on page 215, the second pillar includes showing off one's deeds. This pillar is divided into two parts. The first division showing off the fundamentals in religion. The second division showing off the way the acts of worship are performed. And so this is so the first pillar is about the al-mura'a lahu, right, the audience for which a person is doing their deed. And then the second pillar is al-mura'a bihi, the dissembler or the means by which they're doing riya, okay? It's just to make sure I'm labeling the pillars correctly. So the first pillar is al-mura'a lahu, the audience for which a person is doing their deeds. That is the apparent meaning, but we'll see. I see just a little overlap, so we'll see inshallah ta'ala, but that's my impression. Okay, the second pillar, he talks about the means by which a person does their deed. And so he says the first is showing off the fundamentals in religion, and the second division is showing off the way the acts of worship are performed. So the fundamentals of religion, Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he categorizes it first with iman, showing off iman. Is that clear? Acting like a believer. This is the worst. They're showing off through iman, and these are the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. They're showing off through their iman. And so he quotes the verse in the Quran, إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ قَالُوا نَشْهَدُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ. And when the hypocrites come to you, they say, we testify you are the messenger of Allah. Why are they doing this? They're trying to show off their iman. Like, we're believers. We want to be recognized for being believers, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُهُ. Allah knows that you are His messenger. وَاللَّهُ يَشْهَدُ إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ لَكَاذِبُونَ. And Allah testifies that the hypocrites are liars. In classical terms, a liar is someone who says something contrary to what is true, even if they don't intend it or they intend it. It's just like a philosophical definition of lying. So lying doesn't have to be intentional. Lying in kind of like, in more like, in our like, maybe in books of adab or aqeedah, possibly they talk about it there. Lying is to say that which is contrary to what is true. So Allah says these munafiqeen, they're the kadhibun, they're liars, right? So this is lying, meaning their testimony is a lie, not the fact. Their testimony is a lie. They said, Nashhadu innaka la Rasulullah. We testify you are the messenger of Allah. They lied. They weren't testifying that you're the messenger of Allah. They actually don't testify to that. And so that's the first form of like fundamentals of deen. The second degree, he says, by which a person shows off the fundamentals of deen is to show off the acts of worship. To show off the acts of worship such as salah, zakah, saum, hajj. This is in the case that where people do these acts of worship, these main acts of worship for riya. For riya. And then he said, how do you know? Like, they wouldn't pray their 5 prayers if they were alone, but if they're in the presence of others, they would pray their 5 prayers. Right? I want to just put a caveat there. I think it's important to distinguish people who pray around others because of just like environment is encouraging. I don't think those people are in this category. Sometimes, and oftentimes, like as human beings, right? We oftentimes do things, we don't do things in private, but when we're around others, we're just a little bit more motivated. Does that make sense? We're more motivated to do something. that right there, I think, is different. That's a different form. There is some riya in that. There is some riya in that, but not this level of severity. Not even. I don't think there's even a close comparison between the two, right? When we're talking about the second degree here, is like the munafiqeen. فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ. Woe to the ones who pray, the musallin. What are their characteristics? الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. Those who are forgetful of their prayers. Why? الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ. Because they show off. They show off. During the time of Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, the only people that didn't pray were hypocrites. That was the standard with the Sahaba, right? Like, how would they identify a hypocrite? They wouldn't see the hypocrite at Fajr and Isha. So for the hypocrites, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, after that, people's iman dropped, and so that golden standard of Sahaba had went down. So people didn't pray because of laziness, because of this, because of that. But during the time of Sahaba, the people that didn't pray were the munafiqeen. Why? When did they pray? They prayed when people would see them. This is what it's referring to. Or cases like this where people are praying just to please other people. SubhanAllah, sometimes this can happen with a child and a parent has to be careful. It can happen. Where a child is just compelled to practice Islam by force to the point that the parent is not even paying attention. Does this kid even care about the deen? But the parent is using force. You gotta pray. And the kid starts doing it just to perform for their parents' sake. And unfortunately, they're committing this type of riyah. Like, this kid would not pray at all if their parents did not force them. Or sometimes young women who wear their hijab. Parents force them by force, but they're not checking what is their intention. The girl wears hijab leaving home, goes to school, takes it off. She's doing something that is a fundamental of deen, to wear hijab and be modest. But she's only doing it to please her parents. And this is one gets scared that, hey, like, are these people falling under this category? And so for parents, it's important to be mindful, right? You know, using your authority to require your children to have certain behaviors is fine. It's oftentimes necessary. But if it becomes like that's the only reason they're doing this thing, the parent must be careful, because they might harm the kid more spiritually with that type of approach than they're actually benefiting them. Does that make sense? So da'wah and tarbiyah with children and those under our authority needs a bit of wisdom, because we don't want to create riyah in their hearts, where they're performing, their Islam becomes very performative, just to satisfy other people, specifically their parents, to get them off their back. And so this is the second degree of showing off with by means of like using the fundamentals of deen, where a person is using the fundamentals of deen to show off. And this is, again, it's not as bad as the hypocrites. It's not as bad as the hypocrites, but because the hypocrites, they're showing off with regards to iman. These people, they're Muslims still, but they're committing a grave sin, right? This major sin, where they're acting like they're performing an act of a fundamental of Islam for the satisfaction of other people, or for some type of worldly benefit. Wallahu alam. And then he says the third degree to this is the person is driven to show off in their supererogatory deeds, like their nawafil, and not in the deeds of worship or in matters of belief. Meaning they do sunnah prayers and things of that sort to show off. You know, they pray extra sunan, they'll do extra ibadat, maybe they want to get some type of, they want to impress somebody. They mentioned the example of getting married, right? Young people oftentimes presenting themselves to be just more religious than they actually are, because they want to impress a certain someone. And so he says this also is a third degree. It's not the fara'id, but it's still the fundamentals of deen. They're doing like ibadat of salah and zakah and sadaqah. Why? Because they're trying to impress a certain someone. And so he says that this is also part of that. Or subhanAllah, like somebody trying to get a promotion, like if you work in an Islamic institute, trying to get like some type of position. Politicians, right? Politicians, I think that's even non-Muslim societies, right? Like we can apply the same concept, right? Like performative worship, performative acts of service, right? Have a guy has nothing to do with religion. He's the most anti-religious person, but will claim religion when it comes to certain benefits, and will try to be religious for certain advantages, right? That type of, it can happen for people who are looking for position and advantages, and so this can happen to them. It can happen to people who show up in the masjid, and it can show up to people who are trying to get some type of position in public or in some type of institution where they're acting out these acts of worship. Not their fara'id, but they're doing these other extra acts of ibadat. Does that make sense? They're doing these extra acts of ibadat to show like, oh yeah, like I'm among those people. And so they do that for an ulterior motive. So that's also a severe type of riyah. Now it's not as severe as the second or the first, but it's still a severe type of riyah. And then he says the second division to this, and this is we're on 218 if folks are following along. SubhanAllah, I haven't opened the live stream, but I'm going to open the live stream so I can see people's questions. And then the second division to this, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, this person shows off the way he performs the acts of worship. So they're not showing off the actual ibadat, okay? They're not showing off the actual what? Ibadat. But what they're doing is, they're showing off how they perform the ibadat. Is that clear? They're showing off how they perform the ibadat. So Imam Ghazali, he says, this type of riyah is less severe than just doing the ibadah in itself for riyah. He's saying here in this case, you're performing the ibadah for the sake of Allah, but certain aspects of the ibadah have riyah, they have an ulterior motive. Is that clear? So maybe reciting the Quran beautifully. These are tahsiniyat. Prolonging the sujood, prolonging the ruku', right? Does that make sense? Right? So you're not, the actual act of ibadah is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but maybe somebody notices like, oh, so I'm being observed, right? Or something of that sort. They want to impress, they're proposing and they're praying with their father-in-law. They're like, let me, future father-in-law. They want to act a certain way. This is all riyah, right? This is all riyah. They prolong the tilawah, or maybe the ruku' a little bit, the sujood a little bit. Does that make sense? So the ibadah is for the sake of Allah. Like they pray, but now they start enhancing their worship for the sake of some type of attention, recognition, benefit, ego, superiority. Does that make sense? To show that they have that superiority. And subhanAllah, I had a thought. I want to add to what I said earlier. Remember how I said that one of the reasons why insincerity is so difficult and avoiding riyah is so difficult? Because our nature to always be pursue self-interest. One, the difficulty of always being mindful of our intentions. And I would add, along with that, the subtlety of riyah, the subtleness of riyah. Like riyah can be happening and you don't even realize it's happened. It's such a subtle thing. It's very hard to detect. Does that make sense? And so, also because of the subtle nature of riyah, it's like, you can start something with sincerity and end up with riyah. You can do something sincere during the beginning of an act, before an act, but then have riyah after you've performed the act. Does that make sense? Like you came and you were worshiping Allah sincerely. Your intention was sincere. And then while you were performing the act, you were also sincere. But then after some time has passed, And then, riyah creeps in. And you start to use that worship as like some type of leverage or a way to get some benefit, or you want some recognition for it. And it shows up after, maybe months, weeks, years later. And that's why our scholars say sincerity is required before the act, during the act, and after the act. So that's another part that makes sincerity so hard, because sincerity isn't just in the beginning, it's not just in the middle, and it's not just after. You got to kind of maintain it throughout. And now vice versa, subhanAllah, sometimes you can start a deed with an ulterior motive, and then you get a sincere intention down the road. And we've seen that throughout the seerah, actually, numerous times, where the Prophet ﷺ will give people gifts, and he will give them, worldly things to soften their heart. And eventually, with the proper tarbiyah, their hearts would be sincere. So originally, they might have embraced Islam for some worldly motive, but the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't reject them. You would actually keep giving them. It's okay. He's like, they're soft. We have to soften their hearts to Islam. Let them have this. As long as they're choosing Islam of their own accord, there's no compulsion. Islam is actually one of the most unique religions in that regard. Islam doesn't want people to embrace Islam to boost our numbers, to spread the religion. It's actually frowned upon. It's like discouraged. Don't embrace Islam if you just to do it because you feel pressure. Islam wants sincerity, but you can soften their hearts, right? And this is unique, subhanAllah. Compare that to forced conversion in Christian history and other religions and all that has happened between sects. And not to say that Muslims, we don't have our own share of like inner fighting and things of that sort, but I'm talking about Islam. If you look at the religion in of itself, Islam doesn't want forced conversions. It wants people's intentions to be sincere, but you can soften their hearts with worldly matters, and hopefully, inshallah, their sincerity will come along with time. Right? There is still some sincerity in their heart, but they need a push, kind of, right? And then eventually, their sincerity kind of grows and develops with time. So I just wanted to kind of go back to that previous point about why is sincerity such a difficult task, and why is riyah such a dangerous thing that we have to be aware of. The Prophet ﷺ, he also said that, one of the things I fear most for my ummah is the minor shirk, riyah. Right, he said that one of the things I fear most for my ummah is minor shirk, which is what? Riyah. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us sincerity and to forgive us for anything we might have done insincerely, knowingly or unknowingly. Allahumma ameen. Dhahabu?
So kind of going along that example in the previous one of children who perform acts of worship, generally only through force, what is a way for parents to balance kind of like responding to that in a way where there isn't harm and where they're enjoining good and forbidding the evil, but then also still being responsible parents who are cognizant of their children's well-being?
No. Excellent question. I feel like, we have to address this because we started talking about it. So we'll divert a little bit from the textbook to get into this topic of like parenting. The sister, she asked, Jazakallah khair, what should be a parent's response, and how do you kind of balance the obligation to enjoin the good and forbid the evil without creating this forced practice of Islam, with your children and spouse or those under your care, and I feel like that is a really tough one, because somebody said they can't hear, which is, I don't know. If you can't hear me, please double check your audio, because it is working. We tested it, so it is working, inshallah. I guess they can't hear what I just said, so there goes the dilemma, right? But maybe some of you could reply to them and tell them just check their audio in the chat. Can you guys see if you can see the comments in the chat? Yeah. Are you able to reply to their comment though in the chat? I think other people can see their comments. Yeah. See if you can reply to them, inshallah. But the question was an excellent question, because it is a fard, it is an obligation to forbid evil within with regards to matters of our authority, right? So in your home, it is your responsibility to be like, hey, like, I don't want haram to be done in my home. I don't want this. I don't want that. These are just my boundaries, right? It is an obligation that you have boundaries, and those boundaries are the boundaries Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set, right? But then, here comes the complexity of life, right? Theoretically, I think that's our obligation. But life is a little more complex because if you approach every act that somebody does with that approach, you could cause more harm than good. If you tell your child, well, if you live under my roof, you have to pray 5 times a day, otherwise I'm not going to tolerate it, and you can't listen to any music under my roof, and if you're, subhanAllah, if you're a convert, you have non-Muslim relatives who, might have certain habits or, do certain things like, well, under my roof, these things are not acceptable. Okay, now it's good, a parent, same thing, right? You tell your daughter, for example, father wants his daughter to wear hijab. Well, under my roof, you have to wear hijab. Otherwise, I'm not gonna tolerate your behavior. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, so that's not something Islam also commands us to do, right? Intuitively, we just know, like, okay, that doesn't sound right? So, but how do we reconcile between the obligation to enjoin the good, forbid the evil, set our boundaries, versus not pushing people away because of Islam, and not discouraging them and harming them because of our, adherence to the deen. And so I'm just going to speak off of my judgment here, and I will say that assess the benefit and the harm. If your behavior, if your position is going to create more harm than benefit, then I would say, then refrain. Compromise a little bit. And you're not sinful in that regard. That's just my initial kind of opinion, okay? Don't take it as a fatwa, but that's just kind of what I am, initial thoughts that I'm having. And inshallah, I can kind of think about this a little bit more and also try to do some research. So,
what age too? Depend the age too.
And the age depends, but with regard, and the age does depend, yes, because, when they're younger, it's easier to get them to comply with your requests and rules, but when they're older, you have to be mindful, and that's a factor. So again, I think it all comes to harm. If this is going to create harm, more harm than benefit, then I would say compromise. Take it easy, right? If you forcing your child to get up and pray when you know clearly they don't want to pray, and they're not showing any interest in praying, but you're just using force and authority to do it, like, you have to think like, hey, this is going to be like harmful. I need to stop. Let me back up a little bit and give them a little bit of space. Maybe once in a while, tell them come to Jum'ah with me, or go to some type of gathering of ibadah, right? Just little soft pushes. But because if I keep pushing too hard, this is really going to push this person away. Even like it's going to do a lot more harm than good. Same thing with the hijab and so on and so forth. What I would say is, if it's doing more harm than good, like this kid will not comply, back up a little bit, compromise, right? So I think you have to assess, use your judgment, and consult others. Other people who are in similar situations. Like, how did you navigate that situation? What should I do? Consult others, because compulsion is not a solution. Especially, like the brother mentioned, age. Once they're teens and young adults, you can't use compulsion really. You use gentle reminders and kindness, and the other alternative option is what? Get them out the house? And it's like, come on now, is that really an option that you want to pursue, right? Like, are you doing more good there or more harm? If they're struggling to, maintain like healthy habits, and you're just trying to keep them away from drugs and parties and, boys if they're girls, and, haram relationships, and now you're like, well, you know what, you're not complying with my values, and this is my roof wall, you can get out if you don't, like, yikes, is that the wise thing to do, right? So I would say Islam always looks for the greater, First of all, Islam always prioritizes preventing harm and then looks for the greater benefit. So I would say just be wise, use judgment, and consult others in those types of situations. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, I want to kind of continue, inshallah ta'ala. Did that answer your question? Okay, barakallahu fiki. You have something to add? Yes.
There is a hadith, right, where the Prophet says, teacher tried to pray at 7, and then sort of chorus at 9.
The 10. I believe at 10.
I thought it was 9, and then some hadith say,
But yeah, continue. So yeah, okay. But like, what's your question about the hadith?
yeah, so it says at age 10 to kick them out.
You know, it says you can use physical punishment. Now it doesn't. Now we must qualify that physical punishment in Islam is permissible within Islam, and I'm not a legal expert, but I think there's some like limited I don't know permissibility, I guess, legally or something like that. But Islamically, it cannot be harmful in the sense that it leaves bruising or breaking of bones or any injury of that sort. It can be bruising, it can be injuring the person in any type of form. But a parent can use some type of physical punishment at the age of 10. That's what the hadith refers to. Okay, so the question is, the sister is quoting the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that teach your children to pray at the age of 7, and then at the age of 10, you can punish them physically to pray. And so, what is your question regarding that hadith? No, not kick them out. You can use physical punishment. But even that again, first of all, with those conditions, no injury, no type of bruising. And second, if it's creating more harm than benefit, then no. I would use that as a general thing. If you're creating more harm than benefit, then stop. Somebody asked me the other day, I'll just say they were asking about a situation where they're like, I'm trying to advise somebody, but I feel them very resistant to my advice. What should I do? What do you advise me? I said, with regards to this, I take one verse of Quran as my guide. فَذَكِّرْ إِن نَفَعَتِ الذِّكْرَى. Remind if the reminder benefits. And the opposite holds true. Do not remind if the reminder harms or does not benefit. So take that as a guide. You always have to look at the benefit and the harm. If the reminder benefits, use it. But if the person is going to be harmed by your reminder, they're actually going to feel more irritated. It's irritating for somebody to keep telling you something you don't want to do. You're like, brother, Jazakallah khair, I know what I should do, but I don't need to hear that right now. Right? Like, leave me alone. I don't need somebody preaching to me. Right? We have to be, like some preachers, unfortunately, family members, sometimes we just want to preach and we don't, read the room, nobody wants to hear you right now. Just stop. Right? Stop, right? Nobody wants to hear you. You have to know that. And the Quran commands that. The Quran says, remind if the reminder benefits. And if you see that the reminder is not benefiting, please stop. Because you're actually going to cause more harm. You're going to make them more irritable when it comes to the deen. And in the future, they're going to actually associate a lot of stress with religion. They're like, man, these religious people, they're very stressful people. They're in your ear all day about what you should be doing and how to live your life. They don't give you the space to decide for yourself. So what you do now is you actually make people kind of resistant to religion by that persistent reminder. We're getting into the field of da'wah right now. And tarbiyah and how to preach to people and human behavior and human, just kind of nature. So this is a good topic and I think a very important conversation to have. I will get back to the lesson, inshallah, because I want to wrap up and I want to finish this chapter so that we can, inshallah ta'ala, start the next chapter in our next lesson. All right. So with regards to Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, going back to 218, he talks about the person shows off the way he performs the acts of worship. And remember, these are the tahsiniyat, these are not the actual acts of worship, but the ways they perform it. And he said this is by one showing off by doing what causes a decrease in the acts of worship, like that he bows or prostrates quickly, or like that he does not intend to prolong the recitation of the Quran. When he is among people, he perfects the bowing, prostration, and recitation of the Quran, right? And so this is, subhanAllah, again, I would say that, you know, if a person is doing that because they kind of want recognition, and they're not doing that when no one is there, like, you know, there's riyah. There's riyah, right? And so this is something to be mindful of. The second degree says this person shows off in things of which there is no blame in giving up, but which improve the act of worship. This includes prolonging the bowing, the prostrating, the standing. So it's like you're increasing. There you're refraining from doing things unless other people are there. Here you're increasing and actually doing something. This is a small technical difficulty. They're really the same. They're just tahsiniyat. And again, these are all tahsiniyat. They're doing like acts that pertain to the excellence of the worship, like praying in congregation, joining the first row. These are all acts, sunnah acts that complete the worship. And he's saying like a person who only does these things when other people see them, they're doing riyah. Now, here's a lesser form of riyah, okay? I haven't read this in the text, but this is, again, my own kind of understanding. A lesser form of riyah is doing ibadat a little better in congregation versus not doing them as well when alone. Not to show off, but just because you get motivated more when you're around others. All right? In my understanding, as long as a person's intention is sincerely for Allah, there's no like major riyah like this. They still like will be rewarded, right? They still have a noble intention. Because 99% of people do better when they're around others. Right? I mean, very few people are so motivated and very consistent in how they perform in public and in private. It's just human nature. That's just me throwing up a random number, but I really think like 99%, because that's human nature. We do better when we're around people. And I think Islam acknowledges that. That's why Islam encourages us what? Pray in congregation, go to Jum'ah, be in the company of righteous people, stay away from unpious people, because your human tendency is that you will be inspired by the people around you if they're pious, and you will be pulled down and misguided by the people of you around you if they're not. I think that, and so I don't think those people are necessarily have riyah, but their sincerity lacks. But they still have some sincerity. Their sincerity is lacking. Because when a person, what is sincerity? One of the scholars, he says sincerity is to worship Allah without seeing anyone else present. That's sincerity. To worship Allah without seeing anyone else present. Right? And that means what? Your worship of Allah in public and your worship of Allah in private doesn't change. The quality of your worship is the same. Right? That's hard. It's hard. Because the majority of us, again, we do better when we're around people. But we want to work towards what? Developing. We want to work towards growing from that. We want our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to be subjective to the company of other people. As best as possible. As best as possible. Now, we're going to talk about how do we do that. I'll just kind of throw it out right now. One of the main ways to do that, behaviorally, is that try to have a consistent practice of worship that you maintain always. Public and private, you just maintain it. Teach yourself, I think, number one, because that ensures that, okay, I am intrinsically motivated to do my ibadah. Does that make sense? I'm not reliant on the environment for me to do my ibadah. So try to develop a habit, okay, like at least some habits. Okay, like my witr prayer, my sunnah prayer, There are certain sunnahs, certain witr, my portion of the Quran that I read, I'm going to read it every day, no matter where I'm at and who's with me. Right? Develop that. Generosity. Try to just maintain that consistently. So that's number one. And then another practical step would be, and Imam Ghazali, he mentions this, is to try to have private acts of worship. Private acts of worship that no one knows, is only between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that helps preserve the sincerity in the heart. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all sincerity. Allahumma ameen. And so, subhanAllah, we're out of time. I wanted to... Okay, let me see. I think we can finish this up. Maybe 5 or so minutes, inshallah. Everybody bear with me. Those who are waiting for me and those who are waiting for me to finish. All of you bear with me, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. I just want to finish this chapter so we can move on to the next. And if we can't finish in the next 5 or so minutes, then we will finish it off in the next. The third pillar he talks about is the person dissembles for another in order to achieve a certain end. So this is the end, the actual niyyah itself, like what is the niyyah that they're seeking? Is that clear? The actual intention. What is their intention, right? We mentioned that the intention can be fame and status. The intention can be some type of material benefit. And the intention, usually, these are the three, can be some type of like superiority and ego. So the way Imam al-Ghazali, he categorizes, he says the first kind of degree in regards to this is that they do it, the dissembler's goal is to commit an act of, I want to rephrase how the translator put this together. The first degree, this is on 219, they said the dissembler's does an act of disobedience willfully. I will say the dissembler's goal is to commit an act of disobedience willfully. Okay, this is their intention, meaning somebody is performing Islam so that they can get in a position to do injustice and haram. Does that make sense? They're performing to be like a righteous person so they can be a judge. And then when they be a judge, they want to like give favors to certain people and groups and take certain sponsorships and and so on. Why? Because they're going to commit an injustice. So that's why they're doing acts of worship. Does that make sense? They're doing acts of worship too. Doing this, subhanAllah, speaks a lot to because this applies to other people of other faiths as well. Right? This applies to all faiths as well. As Muslims, our deen has a very strong tradition of analyzing these types of things, but this is human nature. And so many people they go to the church, they go to pray, they pose with the religious people, so they can get to a certain position to continue committing injustices and theft and so on and so forth. Right? Here he says this is the worst form of riyā. The worst form of having an ulterior motive is to do noble acts with the intention of committing sinful acts. Is that clear? That's the first degree. And so that is one a Muslim, of course, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from that. That's more usually with people who want like some type of worldly benefit and greed and pride. Rulers, politicians, things more you see with people like that. All right, continuing. And he said these people are the most detested people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as they have made obedience to Allah a means of disobeying Him and as a vehicle to satisfy their immorality. The second degree, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, the dissembler longs for permissible delights. So now they're worshiping Allah for permissible things in the world. This, of course, is not as severe as the first degree. Is that clear? And this is the one who made hijrah, who's making hijrah to marry a woman, perform certain acts to, be recognized. Like being recognized by people is not haram. Does that make sense? Proposing to marry somebody is not haram, right? But the problem is they're using acts of worship. That's with this intention. That is the riyā. Does that make sense? So that is a second degree, and that's still something that is, again, we spoke about the ruling, is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not love and would be a means for Allah's anger, but not to the close to the level of the first degree. And then the third degree, he says, the dissembler does not intend to earn money or acquire a certain woman in marriage, but strives to improve his acts of worship, lest the people should think him the less for it, or lest they consider him among the ascetics of the devotees of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here he's saying, this is somebody who's just doing it for so people don't think less of them. Oh, if I don't do this, what would they say of me? Right? Does that make sense, right? So they're afraid that people will think less of them. And so he said this is a third degree of riyah, that's also condemnable, and the believer wants to stay away from. Now, again, all of this is not to discourage people from doing worship. It's not to be like, well, I'm actually kind of feeling subhanAllah, sometimes that happens. Because if people are accustomed to you being in a certain position, and you're like, oh, if I don't do this, what will people think of me? It's human, it's okay, it happens, right? It happens. If I don't do this, what will people think of me? And so now you're thinking oh, okay, I don't want to pray, subhanAllah, I'll give a simple, I don't want to pray sunnah before I sit in the masjid, but there's people in the masjid, and if I don't pray sunnah before I sit, they're going to be like, well, what kind of person is this? They just sat in the masjid without praying sunnah. That's riyah. It can occur. Because you're afraid, human nature, we fear the judgment of people, right? And so there's an expectation, you're like, oh, subhanAllah, what will be? So the solution isn't to say, well, I'm just going to sit, so, I'm not doing this act for them. That's not the solution. Does that make sense? The solution is to be mindful, oh, subhanAllah, here's an ulterior motive that's crept into my heart. Astaghfirullah, Ya Allah, accept from me, and then pray. Right? So the solution is not to refrain from the act of worship. The solution is to catch that when it happens. To catch that when it happens and be like, okay, astaghfirullah, I'm going to do it. And also, if your circumstances don't allow you, don't force yourself to do something if your circumstances don't allow you truly. Let's say you have a Zoom meeting, you enter the masjid, and you're just like, you know what, I just want to join my Zoom meeting, but what are people going to think of me if I don't pray sunnah first? Right? Don't overburden yourself. Does that make sense? That's also the case. Don't overburden yourself for fear of people's judgment. But purify your intention, and if you have the means, do the acts of worship. So those are I think all of the categories and degrees and subcategories of the subcategories that Imam al-Ghazali, he gives, rahimahullah ta'ala. It's a bit extensive, but I think he really captures many different aspects of riyah and many different layers of riyah to show us all the complexity of riyah, the severity of the different types of riyah. I hope it is a little bit to kind of get your mind all around, to get your to kind of just comprehend. But for those of you, I encourage you to kind of summarize this so that you can memorize it and really understand it well. And if you don't want to do that, which is fine, just understand that, okay, here are some of the ways riyah can show up. Understand the awareness that one needs to have and kind of detecting it, and also how to remedy it. And inshallah ta'ala, in our next lesson, we'll talk about some of the ways to remedy riyah in the first part of the lesson, and then we'll move on to the next chapter bi'iznillahi ta'ala. And so my recommendation for the reading is reading the entire chapter of Love of Authority. It's a very short chapter. Authority, he speaks about it briefly. We might get into envy, I don't know. Envy is a bit longer. He speaks about it in detail. So if you want to start reading envy a little bit, you can start reading. How long does envy go on for? Envy goes on for 229 to 248, 19 pages. So the chapter on envy is pretty extensive. So finish the chapter on love of authority, and then you can start reading a little bit of the chapter of envy, maybe just the first 2-3 pages, and then inshallah ta'ala we'll try to cover that much in our next lesson. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullah khair wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi walhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Brother Michael. Assalamu alaikum.